Okay, this is video 2 from March 17th. We are talking about mass retaliation. So we said Dulles wants greater reliance on nuclear weapons and air power, spending less money on conventional forces, Army and Navy. This is important as kind of a comparison to Truman and later John F. Kennedy in the 60s, so I'd be aware of this fact. In theory, this would save money, help balance the budget, and increase pressure on political enemies, because now we're going to try to outmatch them when it comes to nuclear weapons. To some, it seemed like a policy of mutual extinction, because we know that both sides are going to do massive retaliation. So even though we're trying to threaten these guys and make deterrence with massive weapons and more nuclear weapons, a lot of folks realize that this just means that each side will do massive retaliation and will both obliterate each other, or mutual extinction. So this policy does not act as a deterrent, but it doesn't prevent. This policy does act as a deterrent, because neither the Soviets or Chinese will try to challenge us, and so we both do end up holding each other off. But it won't prevent little brush fire wars, because there will still be little fights that will break out, like in Asia, Latin America, Africa, Middle East, which we'll cover more as time goes on. Okay, unrest in the Third World. So one big theme after World War II is that a lot of the empires, or a lot of these colonial empires that have been established back during the age of imperialism, began to fall apart in Africa and Asia, especially in the 1940s and 50s. So a lot of these colonies that like the British, the French, the Germans, Russians, whoever had established back in the 1900s, begin to collapse and become independent in the 40s and 50s. But they're also very unstable. Just because they're becoming independent does not mean they're ready to become a functioning government. They just want to be away from their imperial powers. So dozens of colonies begin to break off and become independent in Africa and Asia during this time period. Like famously, India and Pakistan break off from Great Britain in 1947 with Gandhi. That's one example. The Dutch East Indies will break off and become Indonesia from the Netherlands. There's a new term that begins to develop called Third World. So those are a lot of times referred to as Third World countries. First world countries are like countries like us, like capitalists and strong economically, that would ally with us. Second world countries are like the communist countries that world doesn't really exist any longer. And then third world countries are these often unstable countries that lack in a lot of industrialization and rely on other countries for help. So anyway, the need for foreign aid got them used as pawns during the Cold War. So a lot of these third world countries got used by America or by the Soviets as pawns, who need foreign aid, and so forth, need help. So Eisenhower engages in a lot of covert actions. He's the first president to really use the CIA for its full potential. Eisenhower promoted more use of covert action. Undercover intervention in other countries' politics seemed better than sending out U.S. troops. So undercover intervention in other countries' politics seemed better than sending out U.S. troops. So that's what he kind of realizes he can use for the CIA. For the CIA, he can send these guys out and not risk a lot of American soldiers' lives, and just go have them help overturn governments from behind the scenes. The two biggest countries you want to be aware of is Iran and Guatemala. So in Iran, they had recently broke off from the British government. They had established their own elected government, but they decided to seize their own oil wells and oil lands in their country. Britain and American companies had owned their oil for the past few decades, and now with their own government in the early 50s, their elected government decided to seize all the control of these oil lands in Iran, forcing out British companies and forcing out American companies. Well, America and Britain doesn't really like that much, so what Eisenhower does secretly is use the CIA to go in, not fight a revolution, but basically bring in supplies and train people there to fight a revolution for us. They will overthrow the government in Iran, not the CIA, but the people they train, and they will put in place their monarch, the guy who ran off from Iran back in, I think, the 30s or 40s, Reza Pahlavi. Reza Pahlavi, or as his title is, the Shah of Iran, is installed by us as the new government. So we replace this elected government with a monarchy, because this monarchy, we believe, would be better for America. So, which is true because he'll establish a very favorable pro-West government, which will trade with America and Europe. He'll bring in a lot of imported goods from America and Europe, but he will also, more importantly, allow Americans and Europeans to get oil from Iran as a result. Over time, the Shah will be not great to his people, and this will come back to backfire against us in the 70s. But for the next 25 years or so, this guy will run Iran, and we're going to get a lot of good trade out of them. As a result, Iran is going to be very pro-West, but there will be a big revolution against this in the 1970s, which we'll cover later on down the road. Then you have Guatemala. So the Iran thing happened in 53. Guatemala happens in 54, but pretty much the exact same situation. This government in Guatemala was beginning to seize lands in their home country. Some of those lands belong to Americans, giving them away to the peasants, which he wasn't trying to ally himself with the Soviets or anything, but this seemed a little too communist for us. So we helped send the CIA again in 54 to help overthrow this government in Guatemala. And we ended up supporting a dictator become the leader there because he was pro-America and pro-U.S. and anti-communist, which is what we wanted. Even though he wasn't great to his people, we got this dictator put in charge of Guatemala because he was more pro-U.S. Okay. Next, looking at Asia. This was going to be our most serious challenge. First, you have the Korean Armistice, which is kind of a quick recap. So Eisenhower had kept his election promise and helped end the Korean War in the summer of 53 with an armistice, which it lasted until just a few years ago. The threat of nuclear war and the death of Stalin, so Stalin also dies early on in 53, made China and North Korea decide they want peace. So with Stalin dying and the growing threat of nuclear war, that helped end the Korean War in 1953. Korea remains divided at the 30th parallel to this day, and U.S. troops are still there to help, and which is one of the reasons why this war is never finished or resolved, because if the war were to resolve today or restart today, America would jump in on the South Korean side and China would jump in on the North Korean side, and neither one of us wants that, so the war would not be pretty if that happened. All right, the fall of Indochina. The fall of Indochina is us leading into Vietnam, because the stuff that's going on with Vietnam is beginning in the 1950s, but we won't actually fight there until the 60s. After World War II, French Indochina fights for their independence. So there's this colony, I don't know if you can tell on this map, I'm kind of pointing to it here, but if you look here on the map, there's 3 now current countries that were at that time part of this French colony in Southeast Asia called Indochina: Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. So China, like regular China, is here, but this was Indochina here: Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam. Anyway, when the Japanese left there, the Japanese had taken over the colony and kicked out the French back in the late 30s. And so when Japan was kicked out, when World War II ended, France tries to come in 1946 and reclaim Vietnam and Cambodia. But the Vietnamese and the Cambodians resisted and fought back against this happening. So for 9 years, the French will fight a war against Vietnam and the Cambodians from 1945 until 1946, I guess, until 1954. It's led by Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh this is his picture right here. Ho Chi Minh, with a long beard there, was a communist. He lived in China for a while, was influenced by communist doctrine. He wanted, I mean, they're not really fighting so much to make Vietnam communist. They're fighting for independence. They're fighting for their freedom and for their homeland. So they fight in this 9-year war against the French from 1946 until 1954 to kick these guys out so they can have independence. He just so happens to be communist, which means he would make the country communist. So under Truman, starting in 1950, America begins to give military aid and support to the French. No soldiers, but we're going to start giving money to the French in 1950 under Truman to help try to make them win. So it's kind of ironic here because we're giving money to a European power to keep their colony and not to the people trying to fight for independence, all because of the Cold War. We don't want another communist country. We want to do containment. And of course, on the other side, you have Chinese and the Soviets giving support and weapons to Ho Chi Minh's side. The guys who fought for Ho Chi Minh were also called the Viet Minh, V-I-E-T, space M-I-N-H, Viet Minh guerrilla fighters. This is very kind of a Revolutionary War in the sense of like they're out there fighting, like in the jungles and stuff. They pop out, they attack, and go back into hiding, and that's how they fight, similar to us way back when. So the French finally get defeated at a very disastrous battle in 1954 called Dien Bien Phu, D-I-E-N space B-I-E-N space P-H-U. Eisenhower refused to send, so that points Eisenhower in 54. Eisenhower had been giving money to the French just like Truman had, but we refused to send troops in to help the French. So to resolve this, because Vietnam does not want to all become communist itself, there's a meeting in Geneva. So there'll be a Geneva Convention in 1954 to resolve what should happen here in Vietnam. At the Geneva Convention, America was there, France was there, Vietnam was there. They agreed to divide Indochina into three different countries, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. So they'll break off and become different countries. France is out the game. They've lost their colony. Except Vietnam itself did not all want to go under Ho Chi Minh and want to become communists. So they made a temporary agreement to divide up Vietnam at the 17th parallel, kind of like Korea. So Vietnam will be divided at the 17th parallel in 54, where the North will be run by Ho Chi Minh and will become communist, and the South will be run by a U.S.-backed government. The government in the South was anti-communist, but they were also like pro-Catholic because these were guys who were very influenced by Westernization and the French. So Ho Chi Minh ran the North as a communist dictatorship. The South will be run by a U.S.-backed government, not democratic, and it was basically a dictatorship, but it was not communist. It was led by a guy named No Dien Diem, or N-G-O space D-I-N-H space D-I-E-M. He led the government in the South. He was anti-communist. He was Catholic, and he believed in more like modernization, Westernization. They were supposed to hold an election in 1956 to decide, like basically how to come back together. Like Vietnam was supposed to be only split apart for a couple of years. So in 56, they're supposed to hold an election to decide which government would they pick, the South version or the North version. Well, America kind of figured out that the South was not going to win because the Southern dictator, No Dien Diem, this guy right here on the picture, he was not great to his people, and so they probably wouldn't vote for him. So with our support, he decides not to hold the election in 56, and so Vietnam will remain divided moving forward. We'll stop the March 17th notes there, just 2 videos. Y'all have a good day. We'll pick up there tomorrow. Stay safe out there.